Welcome back. Last week, I reviewed a book called How to Stand Up to a Dictator by the journalist from the Philippines, Maria Ressa. And I was really inspired by that book, actually. I was really inspired because it showed the actions of a journalist who was tremendously courageous in standing up for what she believed in, standing up to a dictator. And also, as I mentioned in my review, she was standing up to another form of dictatorship, which was Facebook, which was willfully or commercially ignoring a lot of red flags and alerts around the erosion of democracy in markets where Facebook had a lot of penetration. 97% of Filipinos are on Facebook, and that platform had been completely weaponized by the president of the Philippines to spread lies and disinformation, to serve a very hard-line platform on law and order, which was very intense and included things like extrajudicial killings of people who hadn't even been tried and so on. And I was really impressed because she put so much on the line, this journalist, Maria Ressa, in standing up to power and telling the truth to her fellow citizens and risking a lot, risking proper jail time and a lot of legal troubles to spread a message of the importance of free media, free speech, and so on. I just thought that was incredible. And so it got me thinking that I'd love to share with you some books which I think are really important, have been really important to me in helping to illustrate the importance of democracy, of democratic norms, but also the perils of sliding into dictatorship, of allowing power to go unchecked. And I thought it would be interesting in this age where we see so much fake news bullshit being spread through social media, through people who can't read too good. I thought it was kind of important to show the power of books to help protect a little bit these norms that we take for granted way too much. And we've got to start understanding how fragile these norms are. And to understand that, I think reading some books about it will be very helpful. So I thought of 4 books today that I wanted to mention. Some of them are challenging books because it's not easy reading about stuff that is essential to our political and civil well-being. It's not always simple to read books that are on what's a very complex subject. So here are 4 books that I thought were very useful, at least to me, and that I wanted to share with all of you. If you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe. There's a button you can click down there. Tell your friends, tell your family, and make sure to comment if you feel that you've got something to share with the community with regard to the books I'm talking about in these videos. The first is a pretty simple book. I think most people have probably read it in high school. If you haven't read it, this is one of the most brilliant political books ever written. It's extremely short. It's probably 100 pages, and it's written like a children's book. And I'm, of course, talking about the book Animal Farm by George Orwell. And what George Orwell did here is he wrote an allegory where he wrote a superficially very simple, almost children's tale about a farm where the animals on the farm are fed up of the way humans are managing the farm, and they decide to rebel against these human masters and to run the farm according to precepts of equality and hard work, and that everybody will get their fair shake in this wonderful farm that will be more fair and just in the future now that the animals will run it. So the animals make this revolution. The revolution is led by a class of pigs, literally pigs, of swine. And the whole book, as I said, is superficially told a bit like a children's book, but deep down it is an allegory with regard to the Russian Revolution of 1917. And of course, the pigs represent the Bolsheviks. And what's really interesting in Animal Farm is that all the animals represent different classes that were represented in the Russian Revolution. So if I remember correctly, the workhorse represents the working class, and then the guard dogs represent the secret police. And so the allegory works really, really well. And the main point of mentioning Animal Farm today, aside from the fact that it's really a truly brilliant political book, is that it shows the slow and gradual slide from a very euphoric, optimistic society, this farm, which after the animals take over is full of hope for the future, that they're going to run this farm in an amazing way, so much better than the humans, and how this hope gradually starts diminishing and starts to slide, and the ethics of the leadership of the farm, namely of the pigs, starts to become increasingly dodgy. And eventually it starts to go into full corruption mode, and it's absolutely horrible. And that's where it connects, I think, with last week's book, How to Stand Up to a Dictator. Is that dictators don't necessarily go from a lovely place of democracy on a Monday to a full-blown dictatorship on a Tuesday. There's what's called the salami effect, where people's rights are slowly sliced bit by bit until you realize that actually the rights have really been sliced a lot and you are now living in a proper dictatorship. And I think Animal Farm illustrates that really well. So I would really recommend this book, Animal Farm. It's a simple read. Most people read it in high school. And if you haven't read it, it's really very simple. And it's a great introduction to George Orwell and to his other great political novel on the dangers of dictatorship, which is 1984, which I'm not going to talk about here because we've only really got time for 4 books. The next book I want to talk about is one that's a bit more recent, called Secondhand Time by Svetlana Alexievich, which was written in 2013. And Svetlana Alexievich is a Belarusian journalist who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2015. And she won not just for the political courage that she's shown in standing up to that country's dictator, the dictator of Belarus, who is a nasty, nasty guy called Alexander Lukashenko. Horrible dude. Basically, think Kim Jong-un in Europe. That's the level of the guy. It's astounding that this person is still in power. He's been in power for 30 plus years, and he's Putin's little poodle, and he's a horrible guy. And so she has very bravely stood up to him. This is not why she won the Nobel Prize for Literature. She won it because the way she writes her books, and this book, Secondhand Time, is a nonfiction book. The way she writes these books, they're history told from various points of views, various voices, and this one specifically is told from the voices of the man in the street, and these different voices are played almost like a symphony, and she's the maestro guiding the symphony. And so these different voices interweave. And it's a very unique style of storytelling, very, very unusual. And what this book focuses on, Secondhand Time, what it focuses on is that immediate period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when there was just a massive systemic regime change in Russia and Belarus, where people just did not understand what was going on. For 70 years, they had lived in a communist system where everything was dictated in a command economy and down to the production of widgets in factories, and everything was decided by a small elite of dictators, to a free society which had been advised ill-advisedly by American economic advisors, had been ill-advised to just let it all open up and let's see where it all goes. And so society, political institutions, the very fabric of society was really challenged, if not torn, in that time. And that's when you saw really the rise of oligarchs, guys who were buying, steel companies, national steel companies, for pennies on the dollar. And there was a tremendous amount of corruption and all sorts of horrible stuff going on in Russia at that time. And a lot of confusion with the man in the street, just not understanding, where is the government who's taken care of us all these years, but now there's no more government and the young people want to make money, but we've been told our entire lives that money is bad. And so it's really a look at the shock of what happens when you go from a very tightly controlled regime to complete anarchy. And it's a great description, I think, of the importance of having properly functioning institutions that can withstand and resist these major changes, major shocks to political and social systems. It's a really super interesting book. I know it sounds boring. I get it. It sounds boring. But the way it's written and the way it's put together is really very clever, and it's stayed with me, this cleverness of how it's put together. And I'm also inspired because Svetlana Alexievich, much like Maria Ressa, the author of How to Stand Up to a Dictator, has stood up to a dictator. In 2020, there was a bullshit election in Belarus that was completely rigged by Lukashenko, and he and his thugs grabbed power, and it's horrible, and they really repressed all the protests they were trying to fight for democracy in Belarus. And so Lukashenko went to see his little pal Putin, who sent in, basically secret police, arrested a bunch of people. And Svetlana Alexievich was forced out of the country, exiled, in effect, to Germany, where she, I think, currently resides now. And so she has really stood up to this horrible guy, Lukashenko. And I think, you've got to read these authors who understand what it's like to live in these systems. They're just so full of lies, and understand a little bit these perspectives. And I think this book, Secondhand Time, did that pretty amazingly, actually. The next book I'd like to talk about, and now we're going to go really old school, but I think it's an interesting one, called The Federalist Papers. And this was published in 1788. And so it's an interesting story on several levels. The first being that Publius was actually three guys, and they were John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, he of great musical fame, where you can't get a ticket for less than $1 bazillion a show. But these three people came together right as the United States Constitution was about to be ratified. And just to give you a context here, basically the US had won the War of Independence from Great Britain and had become an independent nation. And so I think it was 13 original colonies in the US were sort of scratching their heads and saying, well, what do we do now? We've got this independence from Great Britain. Should we just, carry on as 13 little countries and everything's great? And of course, there was an idea to say, well, maybe there should be we should unite into a bigger thing, and we'll call this bigger thing the United States. And it seems obvious today, the United States, of course, Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and Virginia should all be connected with one another in this greater country called the United States. It's going to become super powerful and so on. Perfectly obvious. But in those days, it wasn't obvious, actually. A lot of people in Massachusetts were saying, well, we can't deal with people from Pennsylvania because people from Pennsylvania, they do this thing and they talk weird and they blah, 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 blah. And so a lot of forces were saying, well, all these different little states need their own independence. We're not going to do the United States. So basically, these three guys, John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, thought to themselves, you know what, we're going to write some weekly articles in these newspapers, and we're going to do the marketing for the United States Constitution and try and convince people that, hey, it's really important that we all unite into one big thing called the US, because otherwise this is just going to be stupid. We're going to be like these little countries and nothing's going to come of it. But that sentiment of little countries, of people wanting to be little independent Massachusetts, is a lot of what we see today in Europe, with people saying, well, I'm German and I can't possibly deal with people from Spain, and people in Italy saying, well, I can't possibly be aligned with people from Denmark or whatever. And that mentality, the US was facing it in 1788. And so these three guys published a series of books saying, hey, this is what the Constitution would do. This is what our country would look like. These are the rights that would be created under the constitutions. This is what the rights of the federal government would be. These are the rights that the states would have, and so on. And it was an outline to try and say to people, we'd better unite. The point is that, yes, this is a difficult book. It's an old book. It's written in old language and so on. It's not exactly a gripping tale, but it is a really interesting perspective. So if you are looking for a pretty tough read, this is the book where you're going to remind yourself, it wasn't always that obvious that political systems would come together in such a way as to unite states in this way. And if you think about it, this is an incredible document, because the United States Constitution and the United States political system, for all its flaws and all its problems and all the times it's elected idiots and had huge problems and civil wars and so on, ultimately has survived 250 years. And that says something about the resilience of a political system that can withstand those sort of challenges and shocks. And so just for that, I think it's worth understanding a little bit better what was involved when they were writing that document. What was going through their mind? I think it's worth having a look and enjoying that. And then finally, the fourth book I want to talk about today on understanding the importance of democratic norms, of open norms and open societies, is the book called The Open Society by Karl Popper. Now, this is a really, really tough read. Do not venture here unless you are ready to confront some serious philosophical discussion. I found it really quite intense. It's not impenetrable, but it is a very, very challenging read. It demands a lot of effort, a lot of concentration, but it is incredibly rewarding. And this book was written in 1945 by Karl Popper, who at the time was a philosophy lecturer in New Zealand. He was originally an Austrian, but who was a Jewish refugee during the war to New Zealand. And then later on in life, he became best known for being a lecturer in logic at the London School of Economics. And that's really where he made his name, but not where he wrote this book. And this book, The Open Society, is in 2 volumes. And it really looks at what is an open society and who are the main philosophers, the underlying writers and academic thinkers who most challenge the open society, or rather who best feed the opponents of open societies. Now, today in our democratic societies, we think to ourselves, well, obviously it makes perfect sense to have an open society. It's clearly a better model. Clearly better to have information circulate freely. It gives rise to more ideas. It allows better ideas to rise when old ideas are no longer valid. It allows people to change the leadership of their country. So there's a whole lot of obvious reasons why one would want a open society. But actually today, if you look at a lot of stuff that's being circulated on Facebook and social media, there's a lot of dumb stuff out there where people are saying, well, actually, the Chinese system's not so bad because they get stuff done. They're super efficient. Or actually, Putin's not that bad. Russia needs a strong man. They can't do democracy and so on. And so that system's not so bad. It's really important to understand the power that we get in democratic societies from having that openness and that liberty and that freedom and allowing the ideas to circulate. And so the first volume of The Open Society regards Plato as an opponent of the open society. And I always thought, hey, Plato, he's Greek. Greeks did democracy, so Plato's obviously a Democrat. Not at all. Plato was really a proto-fascist who was advocating all sorts of very dictatorial features in society, really intense state control of society, of people, the domination of the state over the individual, and so on. And so in the first volume, Karl Popper tries to demonstrate a lot of where Plato went wrong. And in the second volume, he looks at two philosophers, Hegel and Marx, as being later philosophers who generated a lot of thought that later dictators could take from and inspire themselves from to generate some really nasty ideologies, and namely fascism and communism. So what connects in the book of Karl Popper, what connects Plato, Marx, and Hegel is that they were fundamentally what he refers to as historicists and focused on historicism. And historicism is basically a point of view that says history's got one big arc, and that arc goes in a certain direction, and scientifically you can therefore, if you look at the past and you look at the pattern of history and the arc, you can put in a certain theory to predict that arc. And once you've predicted that, you can predict the future, essentially. You can predict where society is going to go and eventually determine the end of history, as it were. And that's what Marx did. Marx predicted that history was a long arc of class struggle, and that class struggle was going to end with the complete collapse of capitalism. It would self-implode and create this wonderful earthly paradise, that would be so much fairer and so much better, and everybody would be super happy and it'd be great. The problem is with these sort of philosophies, with historicist philosophies that end in a certain pre-predicted point, is that if the pre-predicted point is an earthly paradise where everything's just going to be so wonderful once we reach that point, then people will start doing really crazy shit to get to that point. And will start acting with methods justified by the fact that, hey, we're just trying to reach that point. So we're going to do some horrible stuff along the way because the end point is right up here, and it's just going to be so much better. And so that's what you see in Animal Farm, the book I was talking about at the beginning of this post, which is, we're going to have this wonderful earthly paradise for the animals. This farm's just going to be amazing. But to get there, we're going to have to do this horrible stuff and more horrible stuff and more horrible stuff. So the end justifies the means, and it just gets gross. So this is the problem with historicism, is if you have this arc, this prediction arc, then any idea that goes against the pattern of history that the theory predicts must be wrong, and therefore cannot be expressed, and therefore we can't have that idea, and therefore the political system cannot bend, and therefore you're stuck in a very inflexible way with ideas that can't circulate and so on. So those were 4 books that I really recommend if you want to get inspired, understand better democratic norms, understand better people who fight and stand up for democratic norms, people who have theorized about it and really written about it. These are 4 books that I thought were incredibly powerful and spoke to me. I'd love to hear from any of you what books you've thought about in the past that allowed you to understand better the importance of freedom, of liberty, of open societies, of democratic norms, and so on. I'd love to get a debate going. I'm sure there might be people who disagree entirely with this and say, well, democracy has had its day and so on. And I'd love to hear your comments too, because this is an open forum and I allow ideas to circulate. So your point of view is welcome here. If you've liked this episode, I really hope you will subscribe and stay tuned for weekly episodes around book themes, book recommendations, and so on. In the meantime, keep reading. Thanks a lot. Bye.